Hello and welcome everyone. My guest today is William Davison. William Davison, as most of you will know, is the senior analyst for International Crisis Group, focusing on Ethiopia. And today he has joined me to discuss about a statement that Crisis Group has issued 2 days ago, calling on the international community to act more urgently on the crisis in Tigray. And thank you, William, for joining me this morning. I understand it's early morning and it's a bit of an inconvenience, but thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tekla. It's not too early. I'm in Nairobi, so it's late morning here. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe we should start with you giving us a summary of the state of play as you understand it, William. I think there would be some people who are not really entirely up to date with developments in Tigray, and maybe you can give us a brief summary of what you think is happening.
Yeah, sure. So I think as ever, it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what's going on the battlefield and inside Tigray. Obviously, that lack of telecommunications, lack of access for reporters, etc., makes it difficult. But our understanding of the situation is that, as we know, we've seen about seven and a half weeks of conflict now, since August the 24th. And then over the last week or so, we've seen a shift in that the Tigray forces have clearly decided that they cannot sustain the type of defense that they've been doing so far. They have essentially allowed the Eritrean, Ethiopian allied forces to take over Shire, and then we saw almost simultaneous advances on the southern front, which we know, early in October. I think the first sign that the pressure was starting to tell, the Tigray forces withdrew from those positions they held in northern Amhara. So at this stage, and obviously this has been accompanied by sort of continued bombardment and airstrikes as well, including on urban and residential areas in various places. It does seem like there is quite a lot of momentum for the Eritrean and Ethiopian and allied forces now. We haven't heard about any major breakthroughs on the other sort of major fronts from across the Eritrean border, Rama and Zalambesa, but it does seem that Axum is about to come under the control of those allied forces and considerable momentum in that direction. So perhaps, I would say definitely a new phase of the conflict now, perhaps the beginning of a renewed insurgency from the Tigray leadership and forces. And then, of course, this is also accompanied by the latest effort to get the AU-led peace talks occurring, which is set for Monday, so in a very short period of time. There seems to be quite a lot of activity and momentum around that. It seems fraught with logistical problems given the conflict situation. For example, if senior Tigray leaders were going to travel to South Africa, and then the Tigray leadership and government and forces were forced to vacate Mekele, how would those senior Tigray leaders return to Tigray in those circumstances? But I'm not sure, obviously, exactly what's going on with the arrangements for Monday, but it does seem like there's quite a lot of momentum to some form of federal Tigray meeting. So this was the sort of context that we released our statement, which we can discuss, and really focused on raising international awareness of this horrific situation, and particularly what we see as the heightened risk to civilians from these developments inside Tigray.
Thank you for that succinct summary, William. And I think we'll return to the AU-led process. There seems to be a lot of unknowns there, not least the arrangement with the Tigrayan officials. I think one of the reasons, well, actually the main reason, according to them, that the previous talks were cancelled was because they couldn't arrange the logistics required. And the logistics can only have become more complex now. So we will talk about that. But I think it's those latest advances and the advances by the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces into Axum that had prompted you to write, to issue the statement, and also the nature of the war. It looks like there is indiscriminate shelling and killings of civilians. And it's those factors that have that had prompted you to issue the statement. And maybe you could give us a brief outline of the main pointers that you are calling on the international community to do now.
Well, with regards to that aspect of the statement, it's a combination of action now and then threats of, or the promise of further action if we do see targeting of civilians, increased violence against civilians by the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. Because we're at such a critical moment, and because the African Union process has shown such difficulties in having an impact recently, we believe that African leaders need to both push the AU, but also push their fellow African leaders, Prime Minister Abiy and President Isaias, to rethink here. So to halt the offensive, stop the bloodshed, and start to seriously consider some sort of negotiated settlement to this conflict, which we only see really continuing in one form or another, with all the further devastation that would bring. Further afield from Africa, there is also the potential role of particularly the Emiratis, the UAE, and the leader there, who has one of the closest relationship with Prime Minister Abiy, and is obviously an important sort of benefactor for the government as well. And so far, other than weighing in on the federal side with the provision of military assistance, we haven't seen any more constructive intervention from the Emiratis. And then, of course, moving further afield from that, there was the role of the US. The US has clearly been critical in facilitating the negotiations we've seen, the meetings we've seen, improving humanitarian access. But now the conflict is set to continue. It appears from the federal government statements and everything we know about the Eritrean intentions that they want to essentially completely control Tigray and completely eradicate the TPLF, etc. And that brings the prospect of the targeting of civilians as Tigray continues to resist with a lot of popular backing. Should that occur, there seems to be more than enough reason for the US to push ahead with the promise of its executive order from last year and to start to impose punitive measures on those political and military leaders responsible for any targeting of civilians. Just to mention, there's also the role of the UN Security Council. We're unlikely to see any real forceful action there because of the sort of divisions that exist globally, I suppose. But the UN has at least met again on Friday, and maybe there is an increasing role for the Security Council going forward.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Sorry, there's one other thing that I forgot to mention, but I can come back to that.
Yeah, go ahead, mention it. No problem.
Well, I think in terms of the sort of punitive measures, it's there is something else before that, which is that we still see significant donor support for Ethiopia's government, most noticeably in terms of very large World Bank funding for projects, which are channeled through the Ethiopian government, and that seems essentially, inappropriate given the continuing war, the apparent lack of sincere commitment to a peace process, and again that massive risk to civilians, the ongoing blockade of Tigray. So I think it's way past time that the US and other major shareholders at the World Bank that they put a stop to this funding until the government shows a sincere commitment to peace and lifting the blockade. And that also goes for the International Monetary Fund, who is sort of circling around looking for ways to re-engage with Addis, and also to all other bilateral donors. Humanitarian assistance is essential, given that something like 30 million Ethiopians are in need, of course, including that 6 million who are essentially cut off in Tigray. But really all other funding for the government we don't see as appropriate right now, and is offering the wrong signal to Addis Ababa.
So to start from your last point about the need to continue humanitarian assistance and withhold non-humanitarian assistance, I think that's a fair point, and indeed you explain that in the statement. But the one reservation that many people would have is that even the humanitarian assistance that is being sent to Ethiopia isn't really being used for humanitarian purposes. or at the very least, it's not being distributed to the people for whom it's originally meant? And how do you make sure that the Ethiopian regime is using humanitarian assistance for humanitarian purposes? I think that's also something. Maybe I don't know if you have some suggestions for how international donors could control and monitor how humanitarian assistance is being used. So, for instance, there was a report that the Ethiopian government received funding for something to be done in Tigray. I don't quite remember what it was, but it wasn't, of course, sent to Tigray, and the donor had no way of making sure that that wasn't happening. So that's just one problem that I'm mentioning, and maybe there are other problems as well.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there's the lines between humanitarian and development assistance are quite often a bit blurry. So there's no easy solutions for this, and I think in Ethiopia we have the situation where the UN and all other actors, non-governmental actors, are in effect operating at the invitation of Ethiopia's government. So the government does have a lot of control. We're not about to change those dynamics or the systems that are built up around them anytime soon. So this kind of predicament, this conundrum, will continue. I think all we're doing here really is looking at messy trade-offs in every direction. I think because of the vast and pressing humanitarian need, especially given the drought, that does need to be continued. So all we could really realistically recommend at this stage is more assertiveness from donors and the implementing partners, more vigilance in terms of how money is spent, more transparency, and more publicity about when there are problems with the way that the government is attempting to control humanitarian actors and their assistance inside Ethiopia.
Yeah. So in terms of you call for the international actors to act more urgently, I think one problem that is getting in the way seems to be the fact that all of them have put their eggs in the African Union basket, and I think we know the problems with the African Union. Maybe you wouldn't frame it in the way that I would like to. I think I would say that the African Union is working in close collaboration and in perfect synchrony with the Ethiopian regime. And I think that seems to be the problem. And different, even good faith international actors don't seem to have found a way of bypassing the African Union. So do you have a way of solving that, what it looks like to me to be a conundrum?
It is it's a sort of structural problem to some extent, I would say. The African Union is the responsible body for peace and security on the continent, and there's just a large amount of deference played to that role within the international system, encapsulated by the African Solutions for African Problems mantra. Of course, what we have seen recently is essentially that being exploited and exposed by actors. And by exploited, I mean that even if the AU process is evidently not effective, then it still has a lot of license to continue to be treated as the sort of main sort of peacemaking, mediating actor, despite the evidence. And then in terms of being exposed, the recent very inadequate invitation from Commissioner Faki to the parties and sort of supposedly to the mediators really showed that there wasn't the sufficient levels of commitment, of effort from the African Union to this peace process. But what I think we've seen since then is more international pressure and African pressure for the AU to up its game. And I think that's the sort of phase we're in now, where it's not last chance, but there is, because of that recent, very glaring deficiencies, I think we're now seeing sort of more focus on what the AU is up to now. But yes, I think for the reasons you kind of allude to, we're not going to see a complete bypassing of the African Union. That's not really something that I think the other actors are willing to do here, and maybe it wouldn't be effective because of the amount of pushback. And of course, we should remember that This is no coincidence. This is a very deliberate part of the Ethiopian federal government strategy, in the sense that when they began this war, they described it as simply a domestic law enforcement operation, which was of no concern to any external actor. Well, that's a very different situation now. They've had to acknowledge the nature of the war. Everyone now acknowledges Eritrea's involvement, for example. There is all sorts of international engagement. So instead of completely barring external actors, we see the Ethiopian government try and control that process. And primarily they've done this through insisting on a very prominent role for the African Union and envoy Obasanjo in the mediating process.
So you say in the statement that the Tigray officials are at least partly to blame for the failings of the African Union. You say that the Tigrayan officials have invested almost all of their energy to kind of win back the Western actors, but that they have ignored the African Union and the different African officials, and that has alienated African officials. And you say that by way of course correction in terms of the Tigray government and the officials, you say that they should try to re-engage African bodies and African leaders and the African Union. Can you expand on that? What do you think they should have done differently, and given what has already happened, what do you think they should do now differently to make amends as far as the African Union and African officials are concerned?
There's a lot in there, so it can be hard to expand on it and keep it reasonably concise. So really, just to say, Teklai, I think that those dynamics that I described with the African Union and the federal government's strategy here, that's clearly something which people in Mekele have been aware of. So they haven't necessarily trusted the AU from the start. We will recall Commissioner Faki's statements early on that the Ethiopian Federal Army was carrying out a sort of necessary and legitimate operation, and then the opposition to Obasanjo. So that has sort of naturally pushed, I think, the Tigray leadership towards other international actors because of their lack of faith in the AU. We should also maybe just point out that the Tigrayan leadership, contrary, I must say, to their positioning when they were in positions of federal power, they are looking for quite an interventionist approach from the West here. They are prioritizing human rights concerns, and I think they see Western powers and Western actors who are those who are most likely to propose and to push forward solutions along those lines, whilst they aren't highlighting sort of principles of non-interference and state sovereignty at this point. So I think those are the sort of dynamics that are in play, and suffice to say, with the leadership in Tigray having this lack of faith in the African Union and African processes, that has caused a certain amount of disgruntlement amongst African leaders, and also I think just a tendency amongst many observers to just characterize this as a conflict between your power-hungry outcasts, now turned to rebel activity against the sort of legitimate elected leader. That sort of framing has also obviously would lead to a lack of sympathy for the Tigray leadership's arguments and cause. And then there was also the longer history of the TPLF. They're not necessarily seen as the most humble and accommodating of political actors, whether that's inside Tigray, inside Ethiopia, or further afield. So there's a certain amount of resentment built up there, as well as, of course, plenty of respect for their ability to manage security matters, particularly in sort of regional peacekeeping operations, etc.
If I could play the devil's advocate representing the Tigray government, not that they are devilish, but I think you say that they seem to have made kind of some sort of change in calling for interventionist approach now, something that they were clearly against when they were in power. I think that's a fair point. But from the Tigray government's point of view, one thing that has clearly changed is that Ethiopian sovereignty has now gone out of the window because Eritrea is in Ethiopia. So you can't really invoke the sovereignty argument. I think that's the one point that they would say. And the second point that they will make is that what Ethiopia is doing in Tigray is something unprecedented. It's bombing its own people, it's starving its own people, and that sovereignty shouldn't be used as a cover. So they would say that the fundamentals, the reality has changed, and that's the reason why they are calling for an interventionist approach from the West.
Yeah, I understand. There's different circumstances, of course. But yeah, of course, we remember the the rejection of U.S. criticism of human rights records, or all that coming from international human rights groups. But it is very different circumstances now. And I don't think any need to get further into that debate, of course, although they've been by no means explicit and clear and formal about it. The argument from Addis comes that Eritrea is operating at invitation in alliance with the Ethiopian Federal Army against a terrorist group. But because those arguments have been so unclear, then it does certainly it does invite the points that you're making in response.
Yeah. So in the statement, I think generally, broadly speaking, you call on the international community to act more urgently, and I think in line with that, the so-called A3, and you mentioned that earlier, have kind of changed tack a bit because they pushed for a stronger statement. From what I'm able to understand, yesterday it was China and Russia that vetoed any sort of statement. But anyway, it looks like there is change, at least in terms of the A3. But generally, what is it that you think they should do now differently, practically speaking? I understand as principle, of course, you're saying that they should act more urgently, there should be more focus, because otherwise you also mention factors that are very, very ominous today. But what practical ways do you suggest different actors in the international community should do now in practical terms?
Well, I think that not too much, to be honest. In addition to what I've gone through earlier, efforts at these bilateral conversations with the leadership by those actors, particularly in Africa and the region, who haven't tried high-level engagement from the US up to the presidential level. We think is appropriate because of the gravity and urgency of the situation. That isn't something which has been not a card that's been played so far. Already made the points about the development assistance from bilateral and multilateral partners. That is inappropriate, and then the possibility or the promise, the threat to use punitive measures should we see the offensive continue and targeting of civilians follow. That's also something that should be that is appropriate. Yeah.
So, what do you see something? So there will be talks, at least if they're not cancelled again on Monday, like you mentioned earlier. Do you expect something different? Also, you mentioned the logistical problem in terms of how they're going to transport Tigrayan officials to South Africa, and what happens if the Federal Army or the Eritrean Army controlled airports in the meantime. I think it's a very, very tricky, volatile situation. And what do you see happening, and how do you think that the AU would be able to handle the situation, given that, if anything, judging by the statements and everything that come from the African Union, the only thing you could sense is that there is utter incompetence in the African Union. And so what do you expect in the light of that?
Clearly, it's a very difficult situation in terms of this effort to quickly arrange sort of emergency talks with very quick developments on the battlefield. And I think it probably does add considerably to the logistical problems in terms of getting senior Tigray leaders to South Africa if Mekele is under imminent threat of being captured by the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces, because I'm not sure if the senior leadership were going to return to Tigray, that would seem to raise a problem. I think what's important, the international and diplomatic understanding of this situation is that, or the framing is that it is, of course, positive that we see these increased efforts by the AU and others. It is positive that we see direct contact between federal and Tigray representatives. But even the sort of best case scenario here is some sort of constructive talks about talks, essentially. And that is particularly the case because of all of the military momentum we see. I think that the phrase that your crisis group used in our statement was that the federal government has, in effect, rebuffed the calls for a truce, a cessation of hostilities by its pledge to its stated objective to control all of the federal facilities inside Tigray. Therefore, the most important tangible outcome from this meeting set for Monday would be a truce or a cessation of hostilities, but that really doesn't look practical whilst the federal government maintains that objective of controlling all federal facilities. And if we get to the stage, of course, where they have controlled all federal facilities in Tigray, well, the Ethiopian government can say it's ready for a truce, but then why would the Tigray leadership and its fighting force, why would they consider a truce to be relevant if they've just been sort of removed from power again? So it is a very tricky situation because of the quickly evolving situation on the battlefield, and I think what we're looking at is getting the parties together and getting some sort of clearer understanding on where a sort of initial landing point may be. But whilst we see the federal government set on that objective, of course, supported by the Eritrean military, and whilst the reality seems to be that we will see continued resistance from Tigray's leadership and commanders to any attempt for the federal government, its Eritrean allies, to take control of Tigray, it is going to be really hard to achieve that critical first objective, which would be a cessation of hostilities.
Yes. So just one final question, and I'll let you go, William. And I think we should address the elephant in the room, which is Eritrea. And as far as I understand, Eritrea isn't involved in the peace talks. And I think it's clear to everybody that Eritrea doesn't want any sort of peace negotiation. So even in theory, how could this work without involving Eritrea? It's just, I can't imagine how Ethiopia and the Tigray government could agree on anything without the consent of Eritrea. Also in the statement, for instance, one of the complicating factors that you mentioned is that Abiy may not be in a position to control his forces, partly because Eritrea pulls the strings behind not even behind the scenes, it's in the front foot. So how do you see this work out, even in just in theory? Never mind in practice.
Well, yes, I mean, of course, Crisis Group is trying to be positive and constructive, but we shouldn't let that sort of obscure the challenges here. It is undoubtedly sort of a multi-layered, we see multi-layered obstacles to any form of sustainable peace. One is that, as I've just described, is the federal government going to alter its objective to control essentially all of Tigray? Or if it pushes ahead with that objective, is that something which the Tigray leadership is going to accept and agree to a truce? But even if we assume somehow we get past that obstacle, we do have the Eritrea factor. As far as Crisis Group is aware, the Eritrean leadership has no interest in a negotiated settlement with the TPLF leadership or their military and political allies. And that obviously creates the potential that should we see a sincere federal and Tigray, sincere and sustained commitment from the federal and Tigray governments to a peace process, could Eritrea simply act as a spoiler so that the fighting continues in Tigray with everything that comes with that. The only way that we could really imagine that not occurring is if the federal government came out and said Eritrea is not welcome inside Ethiopia. Previously, we were working with it, but now it needs to withdraw its forces. Possibly that would lead to an Eritrean withdrawal and therefore massively reduced potential for Isaias and his army to act as a spoiler inside Tigray. But of course, that is not impossible to conceive of, but it doesn't necessarily seem like something we're very close to, the federal government issuing that sort of instruction to its erstwhile Eritrean allies. So this is, just a huge obstacle, and it isn't something which the sort of peace process has begun to tackle with. We should never forget all of the outstanding border issues between Ethiopia, Eritrea, or Tigray and Eritrea, whichever way you want to look at it. And then there is the risk of civilians being targeted. We know about the systematic targeting of civilians the Eritrean army engaged in before. And one of the key points the Crisis Group was making is because we expect a intense insurgency to develop, even should the Tigray leadership have to give up on the control of major roads and urban areas in Tigray, that insurgency will have considerable support from the population. And we see it as highly likely that the Eritrean and Ethiopian troops will exact punishment on the civilian population when they suffer reversals or when they consider the population to be supporting the insurgents who are causing them so many difficulties. So there is numerous ways in which Eritrea is a problem here. And again, as the diplomats and the broader international community express positivity about some sort of peace talks, they should remember just what a huge obstacle Eritrea and its leadership's desire to completely see the back of TPLF and everything associated with it, but what a huge obstacle that presents to any form of negotiated settlement.
So if you have some final words of advice, recommendation, especially in the light of the peace talks scheduled for Monday. I know you have said them in pieces and bits, but if you just would like to say a few words, otherwise you could ignore it. If you have
I think the only words I'd like to say, just a sort of reiteration, is that this potential meeting in South Africa is positive, but sadly it is only a very small piece of the puzzle. It's a very baby step in getting us towards sustained peace here. As much as there is international momentum behind this peace process, there was also a lot of momentum inside Tigray for further conflict and all of the civilian suffering that brings with it. So I think it's important for everybody to be positive about these efforts at negotiations, but also being realistic about what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. Thank you, William, for the time. And I would strongly recommend people to read the statement that Crisis Group issued on the 20th of October. It's titled "A Call to Action: Averting Atrocities in Ethiopia's Tigray War." I think it's the right kind of statement. We have been critical of Crisis Group for different reasons, but this was a really good statement in my judgment, and I would strongly recommend, especially people in Tigray. I think he makes some good points for the Tigray government, kind of advice for them to be more conciliatory than they have been, especially to the African Union. I think that's something that they should consider. And thank you for the statement, and thank you for the time as well, William.
Thank you, Teklai. Always good to speak.
Thank you.